mesa redonda. I would like to thank the institutions that are participating today. I'm Elena Centeno. I'm the director of UNAM Tucson, the National University of Mexico office at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. We also want to thank the Institute for Legal Research of UNAM for their participation, and the University of Arizona, and also the Consulate of Mexico in Tucson. Thank you, all the institutions, for participating in the organization of this very important roundtable. The topic today is feminicide, one tragedy, two nations, human rights and gender violence from a binational perspective. I'm very glad to introduce Aletia Fernandez de la Reguera, who is going to be the host of this roundtable. She will be the moderator, and I want to highlight that Aletia is at present the coordinator of the National Diversities Laboratory of UNAM. She is a specialist in gender and migration, and in immigration detention and gender violence and autonomy of women. She holds a doctorate in humanistic studies from the Tecnológico de Monterrey from Mexico, and a master in European studies from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. She coordinates a certificate on gender and equality policies of the graduate program in political and social sciences at UNAM. And she also coordinates the migration area of the University of Arizona UNAM Binational Consortium in Migration, Human Rights, and Human Security. I'm very happy to have Aletia collaborating with us on this important topic. And I also would like to welcome Consul Rafael Barceló, who is the Consul of Mexico in Tucson. And I also would like to welcome William Simons, who is a professor in gender and women studies on the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences of the University of Arizona. We are still waiting for Amalia, who is just connecting right now, who is also a professor and in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and participates in the consortium on gender-based violence. So welcome all of you, or four participants of this roundtable. I'm very honored to have you here discussing this important and delicate subject that affects both countries. So let's talk about this binational perspective and what we can do in the future. Aletia, if you would like to present our participants on the roundtable, I will leave the microphone for you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, doctora Elena Centeno. Agradezco muchísimo el esfuerzo de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y de la Universidad de Arizona por llevar a cabo este evento. El evento va a ser en inglés, pero voy a estar como moderadora haciendo también algunos resúmenes o algunos comentarios en español al finalizar cada una de las rondas de participaciones. Y I really want to thank you, both universities, for organizing this event. The relationship between University of Arizona and UNAM is a very strong relationship. We have been working at least for the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 4 and since 2018, very hard on the topic of migration, human rights, and human security. There is this binational consortium on human rights, migration, and human security between both universities, and that's why we are here today. Bill Simmons and Amalia Mora are our colleagues from the University of Arizona. I will introduce them. And Rafael Barceló, our consul, or Mexican consul in Tucson. Thank you very much to all of you. So the idea to organize this panel results from a collaboration, a quite new collaboration between both universities to start teaching and in a way conducting research and working with students in the topic of femicide. For the first time, we hosted a course on femicide in the program Human Rights Practice with a binational perspective. I had a privilege to teach the course and together with my colleague Bill Simmons, and we were thinking about the importance of thinking, reflecting, and working on the topic of femicide from a binational perspective. Femicide is the political concept developed by feminists in the US and in Mexico to describe, and in many other parts of the world, where it started actually from the Latin American perspective and also in the US, to describe the killing of women as a hate crime against them. Often these killings result from a progression from other forms of gender-based violence embedded in broader forms of structural, cultural, and direct violence, and also from the perspective of necropolitics. The perpetrators could be intimate partners, former intimate partners, acquaintances, relatives, or unknowns. Through negligence, indifference, legal and institutional violence, states participate directly or indirectly in the complexity of these crimes. I will give briefly some data on the US and on the Mexican perspective of femicide. In the US, about 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime. The difference between 4 and 1 and 1 in 10, it's actually the gender difference. That's why we talk about femicide from a gender perspective. In that year 2019, the homicide rate among female victims murdered by males national in the US was 1.18 per 100,000. For that year, Alaska ranked first as the state with the highest homicide rate among female victims, followed by New Mexico and Nevada. The presence of firearm can turn domestic violence into domestic homicide. When men murder women in the US, the most common weapon used is a gun. More than 90% of women murdered by someone they know. This is the scenario in the US, and I think the discussion is very much also in the topic of guns and domestic violence. And in the case of Mexico, it is some way similar, but even a harder situation in Mexico. Mexico, in the region of Latin America, and as a region, shows the greatest numbers of femicides. In Latin America, from the 25 countries with the highest rates in the world, 14 are in our region. And in the case of Mexico, 4 in 10 women aged 15 years or older suffer intimate partner violence. Between the year 2000 and the year 2018, 3 in 10 women were murdered in their homes, with 1 in 10 men murdered in the same circumstances. You see, like this, I mean, what we were talking about, the gender gap in the case of the US and in Mexico. And in just 4 years, 911 calls related to domestic violence against women increased by almost 300%, from almost 93,000 calls in 2016 to 260,000 in 2020. By state, the highest numbers of femicides are the states of Mexico, Jalisco, Veracruz, Mexico City, and Chiapas. And in Mexico, we have 11 femicides per day. So we are here to reflect on the interaction of scholarship, activism, and legal policies related to femicide or feminicide. There's a difference between both concepts from an interdisciplinary perspective to generate social and cultural awareness and transformations about this problem. So thank you for being here with us today, and I will briefly introduce our panelists so we can begin with our roundtable. First, I will introduce Amalia Mora. Thank you, Amalia, for being with us today. She is an ethnomusicologist whose research focuses on the intersection of gender-based violence, women's rights, and performance. She moved to Tucson in 2016 after receiving her doctorate from UCLA, which explored the relationship between sexual violence, racialized narratives on dancers and their bodies, and women who perform for tourists in Goa, India. Amalia is a manager of innovation and engagement for the University of Arizona Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, as well as an affiliated faculty member in the Human Rights Practice Program, for which she has taught a course on the Me Too movement in India and the US. Amalia is also a performing artist who has received training in music, dance, and theater, and her writing on the intersection of performance, race, and gender violence has appeared in a wide variety of publications. I will present now Bill Simmons, my colleague and friend. I have the privilege to also learn from him always. And thank you, Bill, for being with us. He's a professor of gender and women's studies and director of the online human rights practice graduate program at the University of Arizona. His research is highly interdisciplinary, using theoretical, legal, and empirical approaches to advance human rights for marginalized populations around the globe. His books include Joyful Human Rights Law and the Marginalized Other, Anarchy and Justice, and Introduction to Emmanuel Levinas's Political Thought. He has conducted ethnographic research on sexual violence against migrant women and children and published articles and a book chapter exploring legal remedies for the feminicides in Ciudad Juárez, Mexico. He has served as a consultant on human rights and social justice in Gambia, Niger, Nigeria, Bangladesh, China, Mexico, and the US. Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Rafael Barceló, for being with us. Barceló was appointed Consul of Mexico in Tucson, Arizona, and he took office in the year 2020. Previously, he served as Deputy Director General for International Policy on Human Rights at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for international migration and refugee on multilateral fora, and for the representation of cases at the universal and inter-American human rights systems, as well as other civil and political rights. He's a career diplomat in the Mexican Foreign Service since 2010. He also served as a press and cultural attaché at the Embassy of Mexico in Brazil and as political affairs and human rights attaché at the Embassy of Mexico in Costa Rica, also performing as Mexican liaison at the Inter-American Human Rights Court. He was also consultant at the Mexican Supreme Court of Justice, a supervisor at the Institute of Youth in Sonora State, and at the Mexican Investment Consultant Office located in Hermosillo, Sonora. He's a lawyer, and he has a master's degree in administration and public policy by the CIDE. So thank you, Rafael. We will start with our panel. The idea is that I will present three big questions. And the first part will be hosted by Bill Simmons, who will present a very interesting project on Juárez dresses. And then with this project, we can start, we can open the floor to start discussing these three main questions that we are sharing today. The first question for the panel would be, how are human rights activism and academia linked, especially on the issues of gender-based violence and femicide? How does social justice in favor of women and against femicide is part of our academic and our professional activities? And the third question would be, what tools and strategies should be improved to communicate or to teach the issues of gender-based violence and femicide from a binational perspective? So the idea is to start with this interesting presentation from Bill, and then we can open the floor for our discussion. Thank you so much. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alethea, and good morning to everyone. What an honor it is to be here with such an esteemed panel. I really appreciate Arnaldo and Elena for putting this together and doing the organizing and getting such a nice crowd to join us this morning for what is not a really uplifting topic. And I think we were all pretty depressed by the statistics that Alethea shared with us. But I think that also, alongside the femicides, we also have to talk about the resilience and the strength of the people who are affected. We need to realize that the young women and girls who are killed by the femicides are real people who have lives taken away from them, who have dreams, and they shouldn't be seen just as statistics, but we need to capture who they really were and who they really could have been. And we need to do it, and I think they call to us to do all we can to prevent this. And that was the spirit of this event that we held starting in 2003 at ASU. I was there for 10 years, and now I've been at U of A for 10 years. And I hope that this will lead to a discussion of how we can do similar events or similar collaborations on this issue here in Tucson and between UNAM and U of A. So in late 2002, the femicides in Ciudad Juárez became an international issue. especially with a story in the New York Times. And my colleagues and I at ASU West decided we would do some kind of event to shed light on this, to raise money, to raise awareness, to do what we could to shed a light on this issue. The event was so successful in 2003 that we ended up doing, I think it was 8 total events on different issues around the border. All of these issues, all of these events were week-long events that brought together the campus and the community. They were all binational. They all involved grassroots organizing. Public art was a huge part of this. It was always what was going to be the signature piece of the week. We always had film and theater premieres. We had expert speakers. In one year, we had 50 different speakers from several different countries. And throughout, we were partnering with the Mexican consulate in Phoenix, helping to get the word out and to really, make this a binational event. So what we thought we could do is we wanted to change the discourse, or to at least make a dent in the discourse on migration issues in Arizona. And as you know, at that time, the discourse was really bad. And we thought if we could privilege the voices of marginalized people, if we could present art through theater or music or film, we could interrupt that hegemonic discourse that saw migration as an issue about securitization, enforcement, and stigmatization. So the first year, our first event, and we didn't know that this would lead to 10 years of events, we decided to focus on the murders of women in Ciudad Juarez. The official count, or the quasi-official count at the time, was 300 women had died. There was a new film out that from Academy Award winning filmmaker Lourdes Portillo on that issue, and we just said we had to have Lourdes come there. We did a panel, a town hall, public art event. You can see we raised money. We did a food drive for kids in the colonias in Nogales, Sonora. And it was quite a successful event. We had a couple thousand people attend. We raised money for a women's shelter in Juarez, a lot of media coverage. We were nominated for awards. We built a network of people who are still in touch on these issues. But the centerpiece really was this dress exhibit. This was directed by my ex-wife, Irene, who's an artist of some note. And she came up with a sketch of what this should look like, which was that it would be memorial dresses, and we would make one for each of the women who had been killed in Ciudad Juarez. We decided this would be a completely participatory activity, with the dresses would be made in workshops in both sides of the border. We would get Mexican-American artists, Mexican-American community members, Mexican artists and community members, and we would all work together to make dresses. We decided we put the dresses on pink crosses, which was a symbol that the women in Juarez were using. And so we had to make 300 pink crosses. And I still have shoes with pink paint on them from that experience. We put the exhibit up on the lawn at ASU West. And you can see community members and everyone working together on this. And each part of the exhibit was more powerful than the next. Just having the 300 pink crosses by themselves without the dresses was very powerful to see. This was the first dress that was made as an example of what these could look like. This was a little intimidating. This was made by Irene, and none of us felt we could create dresses as good as this, but we quickly learned that we didn't have to make something quite as nice as this. And so this is what the exhibit looked like. And you can see the dresses were all over campus. This is a dress made by a local mask artist, a very famous mask artist, Zarco Guerrero. A week before the exhibit and the event, a 6-year-old girl was found mutilated and killed in Juarez. And so many of us made children's dresses. when the wind blew through the exhibit, it was incredibly powerful. And I had the honor of being able to walk out there at any time. And at one time, the dresses were blowing so hard that we thought the crosses would break. So I had to lay all the dresses down on the ground, and it looked like a burial. It looked like a cemetery. It was incredibly powerful. And this is what the exhibit looked like from the library. We also held candlelight vigils where we marched through, having students, having some undocumented students read the list of the names. And of course, so many of them were unidentified. So as they would say, unknown, it was incredibly powerful. The dresses traveled a lot. The biggest event having to do with this issue, the V-Day March in 2004, the dresses were prominent. We have pictures of our dresses up by Jane Fonda and Christine Lottie and other famous Hollywood stars. And then a couple years later, New Mexico State held the largest event ever on the femicides. And by then, unfortunately, we were up to 450 women and girls had been killed. And by then we had 450 dresses and crosses. Because it was in Las Cruces, many of the family members were able to join us. We didn't know how they would react. There were some art exhibits in the past that they did not like, and so we were a little worried. But they ended up spending almost all their time, all their free time at the event, among the dresses. And when a new van load of family members would come up from Juarez, the other family members would run, meet them, and say, "You have to come see this. You have to see the dresses." And we made special dresses for some of the family members, and then we gave many of the dresses to the family members. This is a picture of some of the family members, my wife, my ex-wife, and two of the scapegoats who were blamed for the murders, but had nothing to do with them. And so it was great to bring all these people together. The dresses traveled. They ended up in Sweden at National Museum. This is a picture of the Queen of Sweden in front of our dresses from little old ASU West. That was really quite something to see. The dresses ended up at Stanford University, and an exhibit in Denmark, in San Francisco, and other places. The next year we thought, well, that was so good, why don't we do it again? We did it on the 205 migrant deaths in the desert from that year. And you can see we did another week-long event with all kinds of events, 50 speakers, film showing. It was even bigger than the previous year. And the public art piece was a 110-foot long border wall that we had made with murals from Mexican and Mexican-American artists. Some of them were done while the wall was up. Some of them the panels were made beforehand. A couple of the guys who were Mexican artists were spray paint artists, and they came and did it that night. And I was afraid they were vandalizing the wall because we had anti-immigrant protesters. And we thought the anti-immigrant protesters were vandalizing it, but it was actually some more artists doing a couple more panels. So, but some really amazing panels done. We did an opening ceremony with a masked dance that was really powerful. And had a Mexican drummer. We also made 205 migrant cajitas. Small boxes, small memorial boxes. We had a premiere of The Gatekeeper, which was brand new at that point. We had a premiere of the play, The Crossing. I'll just skip forward and end with, we had an event in 2008 on education. And the cool thing was we brought the wall back and we put it in the shape of a God's eye, Ojo de Dios. And to symbolize education and also to symbolize life journey. And in the middle was a classroom. where to symbolize education. And we had more panels. This has got to be the world's largest God's Eye ever made. And we had God's Eyes all over Phoenix, basically. And to symbolize education and also migration, we had backpacks throughout. And we had the voices of undocumented students resonating throughout this exhibit. We had street theater. We held classes out by the God's Eye. And I'll end at that. So kind of gives you an idea of some of the ways that we can bring the community and the campus together, work binationally to draw attention to events or to issues that affect us binationally. And I hope our discussion leads to some ideas like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. So yeah, now we can start with our panel. Basically, this was a very interesting project to understand how human rights activism and academia are linked, and especially on the issue of gender-based violence and femicides. So the floor is open to discuss these relationships between academia and human rights activism, and also about how social justice in favor of women or against femicide is part of our daily professional activities. So the floor is open. Please, Rafael, Amalia, as you wish.
Thank you, Latia. Thank you to everyone who helped to organize this event, Dr. Centeno, Dr. Bautista, Aletia, for your great moderation, and also to Bill and Amalia to be able to get this talk with you. It's very interesting to try to answer about the links between human rights activism and academia, since I'm from the government. So I say I will be like the third spot in this triangle, so to speak. But I've been participating in these events, and I am convinced that there is no way that one part or the other does everything that it needs to be done. It needs to be intersectorial. So being the realm of violence against women so multifactorial, and still, and we have to admit this in these kind of spaces, so many people in our society still has not heard about it. So we need to acknowledge this. It's like we are sometimes preaching among convinced, and we don't realize how many people actually has not participated in these conversations. So even people that is well-intentioned don't necessarily will understand the violence against women as a separate form of violence, with its own causes, with its own consequences. And the fact that more men are killed in our countries than women confuses a lot of members in the society, and that eclipses the awful nature of femicides. That less women are killed than men hides the fact that when we talk of femicides, those killings are related and caused primarily because of the gender of the victim. They are the most catastrophic result of a power relation where the victim is socially understood as inferior. There is a huge challenge in addressing this confusion, but we have to acknowledge that this confusion exists, and we have to address it so more people understand this problem. So and just to give some data that might cause this confusion, in Mexico in 2020, the rate of femicides, it's awful. It's 1.5 for every 100,000 inhabitants. But the homicide rate in the same year, it's 29 for every 10,000 inhabitants, according to INEGI. So of the total amount of the people who were killed, 11% were women. Not all of these women were killed by femicide, which is a posterior criminal determination based on information that it is a gender-based crime. So for human rights activists, I particularly feminist groups, they have played a pivotal role in making the society of both Mexico and the United States to be more aware of all that forms that take the violence against women. The deepest social changes come from the society itself. And this activism has proved, both for Mexico and for the United States, their importance to initiate those changes that need to be done, and also to make governments accountable on their actions on this matter. So that from the human rights activists. And academia has, in my perspective, been one of the main triggers of this activism in at least two ways. It's providing the concepts, information, and critical thinking to be able to isolate this social problem and make a characterization that made evident that addressing femicides, it was a priority. And second, also about fostering networks of education and sensibilization to make it more visible. This is a constant process of academia, and sometimes more successful than others, like also occurred, for instance, in the climate change crisis and the need to act. So they were like triggers, they were igniters of these processes, social processes. The outreach of the scientific work made in academia, nevertheless, is limited. Sometimes it's very limited when we consider the numbers of the society at large. But actually, it provides the best spaces to, as I said, to ignite the reflection of a problem, to get knowledge. And this is where I find the best link, not only with human rights activism, but also with the government. It's first to provide, and second to provoke. Provide with knowledge, with scientific information about the problem, and about the advances and the lacks of advances. And I'm glad that you invited me, because this problem needs to be addressed, as I said, always in intersectional spaces, academia, civil society, and governments, to fight the femicides, to fight the impunity that have enjoyed many perpetrators, and mainly to fight about the causes of all gender-based violence. At the consulates, we have, so to speak, a privileged position to understand always from a binational perspective every subject, because our families are binational. So we need to address this always in a binational perspective. So these kind of spaces are very useful for us also to understand what's going on, to have a better understanding, and also to come up with better solutions to significant problem, not just from men in Mexico, but also from women in Mexico, but also for women that are migrants in the United States, which are particularly vulnerable to this situation. So that would be my first intervention. I like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. The floor is open. Thank you, Amalia.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you, Alethea, and Bill as well, and everyone for having me. I would just like to reiterate, actually, or at least piggyback off of what Rafael said in regards to a few things. In regards to, first of all, just the role of academia. I think when we're talking about human rights work and social justice work, there is maybe this idea that it's separate from, academia, that applied work is somehow different than academia. And I would argue that human rights work and social justice is inherently applied, right? And so even if one takes an entirely theoretical approach to understanding and teaching and defining and unpacking gender-based violence in an academic framework, that this will inevitably, the intention of it is that this work will inevitably be hopefully used for change, right? And for hopefully positive change. And I think that there's a particular responsibility right now to equip students with knowledge and the language and the tools to address gender-based violence. And we're amidst, there's a ubiquity of misinformation going around right now. There's a backlash against social justice movements, not just Me Too, but Black Lives Matter, right? We're seeing the rise of right nationalism. And also we're seeing a lot of violence at the intersection of overlapping feelings of marginalization and emasculinization, right? So, Rafael, you mentioned things like climate change and sort of the lack of job opportunities and the sort of income inequality that's so ubiquitous now, that is giving rise to violence against women and femicide. So I think it's more urgent than ever to recognize the importance of an applied focus in academia. And I think that's one thing that the Human Rights Practice Program, does so well and emphasizes. And so that's sort of first and foremost a point I wanted to make in this regard. And another point that Rafael mentioned, although this maybe relates more to sort of maybe some tools or ways of thinking about femicide. I'm not a specifically femicide expert, but one thing that I think is key to understand is that, and that I try to teach in my classes, is that really at the root of all gender-based violence and femicide is this belief that there are certain beings, namely women or anyone who's considered antithetical to normative masculinity, that is not deserving or capable of body autonomy, right? And so this violence exists on a scale where femicide might be the most extreme and horrific and version, but that this other belief ultimately in this undeservingness of body autonomy, right, is at the root of this violence. And I think that's why people get confused. And I noticed somebody in the chat asked, does the term femicide exist in the United States, or in certain states it doesn't exist? And that's a great point, because a lot of people don't know the term, whereas in Latin America, more people are familiar with it. And I think that's because, and Rafael mentioned this, that actually, women are victims of femicide because of behaviors that are gendered, right? It's not always explicit. It's not always like, I'm going to go out and kill this person because they are a woman. It's like, you talked back to me at dinner, or you didn't cook the lunch properly. One of the guest speakers in my class, Dawn Wilcox, she started the first national database on femicide in the US. And that was just something that she mentioned that was so startling to me and very poignant, right? That these women are being killed for behaviors that would not otherwise result in murder if they were not women. And so I think that's sometimes hard for people in the United States to understand, because we don't have this familiarity with this term, right? So I think in academia, one of our responsibilities is to emphasize this point about lack of body autonomy and the fact that people are being killed for behaviors that are very gendered. And when women are not considered to be exhibiting these behaviors in an appropriately gendered way, they are killed or otherwise harmed, right? And I'll just leave it at that for this response.
Thank you, Amanda. I would like to add something. I think, in the experience that we had this semester, teaching this course on femicide, it's so important to have the binational perspective because of many aspects that you have shared with us this morning, but also the importance of reading Latin American authors. We saw the numbers, and we saw that Latin America as a region has the highest rates of femicides in the world, but also in Latin America, we have such important examples of activism, and activism that has led to important ways of putting pressure into governments and the states to push forward to better legislation and better public policies. So I would really like to say that the human rights and activism, I totally agree with you. We cannot divide, and still we have some students that tell us in other class, they are telling me that I cannot be student and activist at the same time. And we always say, I cannot imagine my life as a researcher or as a professor without being activist. But in terms of femicide particularly, the importance of reading Latin American authors has been key to improve, to have a much more critical elements and critical reflection for femicide, not only in the US. In our class, we have students from all the world, So it's not about the Latin American authors, but also about the Latin American activists, and to understand the impact of human rights activism, particularly for femicide, in the continent, in the region, and particularly through the case of how these activists have improved and push forward mechanisms at the inter-American system of human rights, particularly with the case of Campo Algodonero. I mean, we're not going to discuss Campo Algodonero today, but it's just to give an example of the importance of having a binational approach and to understand the value or the achievements of feminist activism in Latin America. And just to say something, because it's in the chat, that they said that femicide and feminicide are actually the same, are synonyms, and they are not, is clearly an example of how the Latin American perspective has moved forward the legal terms. And feminicide is a term that actually accentuates the role of the state, not only to because of the impunity and the role that state plays in femicide, but also the indifference of the state. So when we talk about femicide, usually it's more like the intimate partner homicide. And in case of feminicide, we accentuate the state. So, and this is an example of how we have worked together. And I think I have more to discuss, but maybe later I want to talk about how we need to conduct fieldwork and how we need to work with NGOs from the academia, but I think Bill has much to add from this side.
Oh my goodness. There's so much to talk about. I mean, you three have laid out so many different issues and so many complex issues. I mean, as far as what is the role of academics, and I mean, we're very fortunate that we are running a human rights practice program, right? Because practice means that we're actually teaching students how to do something. And since it's human rights, we kind of get a pass on some of the activism piece, right? Because human rights are something that everyone is supposed to believe in. They have different definitions, different perspectives. But, you know, I mean, it's hard to find a student who doesn't support human rights. So it's you know, we don't get the pushback from students for doing our activism in our classes. And so that, you know, we're just in a very privileged place that way. And so each of our classes, almost all of our classes are actually having students work on real world problems. And you mentioned the Cottonfield case, Alethea, from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Some of that actually came out of a class I was teaching, an undergraduate class way back in 2002. And I was teaching an undergraduate law class, and I came in, we were going to do a 4-week module on how to use international law to advance the cause against the femicides. And I put up on the board, femicides, Ciudad Juarez, international law. And I said, students, you know, for 4 weeks, we're going to try to figure out how can we bring a case in some forum. And the student, and we considered like bringing a case to UN bodies, bringing using trade laws under NAFTA. We looked at how to use the Inter-American Development Bank as a lever to do something about this. And we settled on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights as a class. And these are undergraduate students working with me. And then we were like, okay, how do we get the, you know, as you said, feminicide means state responsibility. How do we hold a state accountable under the American Convention on Human Rights for what's going on in Ciudad Juarez? And so we were saying, well, we're not going to, you know, weigh in on whether members of the police force or members of the national police force are committing the crimes directly. They may be, but we're going to say that they have a affirmative duty to protect and to investigate. And so we looked at European Court of Human Rights law. And this was students and I doing research together, bouncing ideas off of each other. And from that, I ended up writing an article with a student about this. We talked with the attorneys in Juarez and gave them all this information. And they used that for some of their legal briefs, and some of the amicus briefs used our work. And then that made its way into this groundbreaking case on gender-based violence in international law. And so, undergrad students, 20-year-old biochemistry majors, made an impact on, international law and one of the most important cases on women's rights. And so, I think that there's ways to navigate this that academics can not only, as the consul so beautifully talked about, to provoke and to provide information, but also I'd like to think that there's a way for academics to be a place where we can bring the community together, where students, faculty, and community members can work together to advance problems that the community member has. Now, like I said, as I started, we're privileged because we're a practice program. We're producing master's students and undergrad students now, but we're not, we're not producing PhDs who have to publish. We're not, we can say we're advancing human rights, which is a universal discourse. So, but I like, that's really, how much can we push the envelope? How much can we be involved? How much can we, especially as a fully online program, can we do work around the world? And I think we've shown that. I know one of Amalia's classes has worked on gender-based violence issues in India through a U of A human rights program class. So that's curious to me, is how far we can push that.
Thank you, Bill.
Alethea, if I may.
Okay.
Yes, I would also like to address the very important question about how does social justice in favor of women and against femicide is part of our, it said, academic and professional activities. It's like for the government of Mexico, where we have this problem and we have acknowledged that we have a problem, and that's incredible. But that was an advancement in a moment, just recognizing that we had a problem. So many problems lie ahead of us. But we think the first thing that we have to understand is like the underlying cause of violence against women. And we have said that femicides are the cruelest of the manifestations of this violence. But the underlying cause of this violence is a problem of an unfair relation of power, or relationship of power between men and women. And that has permeated our societies from very long time ago. And so if in our job spaces, we don't do everything that is possible to make the equal access of opportunities for men and women, all those violence against women might be more difficult to approach. So, but at the same time, recent economic and social changes have favored and enhanced awareness of this power imbalance, but also we have seen, combined with other causes, in countries like mine, like Mexico, an increase of the number of women that are being killed because of their gender. So I think we need, in this big social justice project, we have to always try to cope with the challenges of the rule of law, the criminal prosecution and sanction of femicides, and all other forms of homicides too, need to be addressed as a priority for everyone in our society. So that needs to change the way we conduct our business as public servants, for instance. It needs to it needs, as we have mentioned, be addressed from every part of our society, because it is a priority. It's a tragedy of our days, and we have to act. And I will seize this opportunity to try to answer one question that was made in this chat about what happens with a femicide or any other homicides. Actually, the perpetrator ran away to Mexico, for instance, if he did it in the U.S., or it can happen also the other way. Of course, we are talking about binational realities of so many people. So it's unfortunately, it's something that people might try to do to avoid justice. The answer is it's quite complex because it relies on the prosecution of this crime. So all of these proceedings are made by the attorneys in the U.S., Ministerio Público in Mexico. But what I would recommend for anyone who has a problem is like to also resort to the consulate of where this activity might have happened if the victim was Mexican, because I think that's a way that the consulate might be close to these attorneys to try to provide justice, and it's another point of pressure to try to do it, because it's going to be harder for sure. We have to do that. We have to know that it's going to be harder in this binational context to the procuration of justice. It is what it is. We have two very different legal systems, but also there's a way that the consulate might help. So I just try to answer that. And also I want to talk about the feminist foreign policy that Mexico has decided to take, and it provides us with a lot of commitments, and we need to make more commitments to make this fight against violence and discrimination against women a reality. And as I said, it's an everyday learning lesson being in a consulate and seeing how reality operates in this border context. So it's like for families that are mixed, that have some members in one part of the border and the other members in the other part of the border, a reality like this might make everything much more complex. And dealing with cultural and linguistic barriers in another country. So it's a work of so many people, and the consulates of Mexico or other consulates might only do this because they form alliances with local authorities and with civil society organizations and with academia. It's not possible to do it without. And particularly because we have to focus in the special disadvantages of migrant women and girls. It's a terrible reality that most of half of the women that have migrated have been victims of violence or assault, more of half of them. So it's like when they are trying to migrate, but when they are in a community where they are marginalized, the reality is even more complex for them. So I think we have to incorporate every tool and strategy possible. But in my opinion, synergies are the most successful one. Synergies with civil society, with local authorities, with counselors, with the academia, and we have to keep working on that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. So the floor is open.
Yeah, and I would just in thinking about kind of tools and what Rafael is alluding to in terms of, looking forward, right? And what can we do? So one of the questions was tools and strategies, right? And I think, and thank you, Alethea and everyone for bringing up the fact that we really owe, Latin American framework for understanding feminicide versus femicide. And I think that, number one, I think in terms of tools or strategies, I really think that, not to keep plugging the human rights practice program, but I think that making more programs connect students to activists, to advocates, to people who are doing this work, and to meeting those people where they're at. When I worked with Dawn Wilcox, and also who, as I said, works on femicide in the US, and then also I brought a guest speaker into one of my classes, Anita Lucchesi, who founded the Sovereign Bodies Institute, which addresses missing and murdered Indigenous women. They both emphasize the importance of really meeting the families of these victims where they're at and what they need the most, right? And so oftentimes I think that, in academia, you're in this little tower and you're thinking of, what maybe would be interesting, students aren't necessarily thinking of, maybe they would think of it, but they don't initially think, okay, well, what do the activists need the most? And, Anita said, sometimes it's just a cup of water, sometimes it's doing on the ground, Google research. It's not going to necessarily be writing some grand report, right? Or conducting research in the way that academics might, but maybe sometimes it is, right? So some of my students worked with Alba Jaramillo, who works advocating for migrants who are fleeing based on gender-based violence claims on the US-Mexico border. And she said, I really need help doing research on why these migrants are particularly vulnerable at each stage of their journey, right? From why they're fleeing in the first place to the violence they experience on the journey, and then at the border, if they even end up filing the asylum claims, why they're vulnerable in that context, or even after, if they don't go through this sort of legal processes, and in terms of the binational perspective, also recognizing, as everyone has mentioned, state complicity, things like the fact that most migrants don't feel comfortable going to law enforcement, going to law enforcement because of border control, relationship with law enforcement. So I would say, that having a program like this one, not just in academia, but otherwise, where people are able to work with activists and advocates and meeting them where their needs are at. And then I would say also just kind of the importance of recognizing, yes, the state complicity piece. And then I would say emphasizing what is really at the root of this violence. Like Rafael, you said, the power relations, the lack of body autonomy. And so, kind of encouraging students to think about violence against women in that broader way.
Thank you, Amalia. I would add some things that, after hearing about you and also my experience teaching the course of femicide at the Human Rights Practice Program, how do we understand and how do we teach intersectionality? Because as a political concept, it comes from the Black feminists who started to talk about intersectionality. So it has this political approach, but also the methodological approach. And in our experience, we have learned a lot from real cases that are happening and that are handled by NGOs with families and with activists. And in the particular case of intersectionality related to how do we gather data, because it's in our chat, there is someone asking about gaps and biases on data. And it's so important that, for example, we started to learn about projects and how, particularly with the one Mexican NGO that is called Data Civica, and how are they identifying the lack of intersectionality? Because depending on the context of femicides is the type of data that you need to gather. And of course, we have so many challenges ahead, because even though in academia, there are many people that are actually working to improve those methodologies, still, if we talk about women, Mexican women that are immigrants that disappeared at the border, is not the same that we have a case of a Native American woman who disappeared. So intersectionality is about many things. It's about how do we understand the problem, and how do we pose questions and research questions to solve that problem. And I just wanted to address that from the binational perspective. There are many problems in how to handle data, because official data contradicts with data that is gathered by NGOs and by activists at the border. The CEDAW, the Commission Against the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, launched a very important recommendation to the Mexican state in the year 2018 about migrant women who are disappearing. And that there is still, the first problem is to understand how many women, migrant women from Central America, have disappeared in the Mexican territory. How many women disappear at the border, at the desert between Mexico and Arizona. So the way we address intersectionality, and for me it's a big challenge from the academic point of view, is how to teach students to really use these tools. I just want to mention something very important, Bill and Amalia, that we are working with undergraduate students and with graduate students that are not looking for a PhD. And this is a very particular profile, because our projects are always taking place in a community-based level. And this is something that I hope it could be replied by other programs, because the results are different. The results is different if for their final projects, they really have to go and ask the questions that Amalia is saying. How can we help? How can we contribute to this cause, to this movement? So I just wanted to highlight this particular challenge on intersectionality. And two other things that for me are very, very important. The first one is also to learn about journalistic research. Sometimes in the academia, we're only thinking about actually formal publications in journals. But what we have in this particular case, from the perspective of journalistic research, is really something that we really need to look for. In our project for this year, we worked with a documentary of Las Tres Muertes de Maricel Escobedo. We invited the producers of the documentary in, and we discussed journalistic research and the importance of learning how to create narratives that actually take the, you were talking about, Bill, the resilience, how to create narratives that bring back to life the resiliences of families and of social justice. And the best example for us is Las Tres Muertes de Maricel Escobedo, and the great effort that this team that produced the documentary, it is a binational documentary also, the team is binational, it's between Mexico and the US. And it's incredible to see how many things we can learn from other perspectives that are not formal perspectives from the with academic rigor that we would expect, but that actually are teaching us a lot on how to ask the questions and how to organize a team that reflects on these questions. I just wanted to highlight those two aspects, intersectionality and journalistic research.
Alethea, if I can respond to both of those, I mean, that's so important. And I think that ties into your earlier comment about, that, and Amalia's work as well, that feminicides are rooted in a certain mindset, a certain patriarchy, a certain way of looking at vulnerable people as disposable. And Alethea used the term necropolitics, right? The politics of who has rights, who has the right to live. And I think that mind, I mean, I think, if we not to get too theoretical, but to be decolonial and feminist is to say that the mindset that is behind the university is complicit in maintaining this mindset that leads to feminicide. And we could, argue how much, it's to blame. And so, you think of Audre Lorde's quote, right? The master's tools will never take down the master's house. And so we can't, we're trying to use the tools of academics, which is seeped in the same kind of mindset that is what's creating the problems, right? And we can argue, we can talk about the philosophical moves to make that claim. But if that's the case, then like you're saying, we have to get out of certain habits in academia, which is, we have a certain reward structure, and we have, certain people we have to respond to and answer to. Can we do that and get outside? And I think, we're trying to do that with this program, definitely. And I think, even like your question about intersectionality, to try to tie all these pieces together into this tapestry, when I think of intersectionality as an academic, I think of it in certain ways. But then when I work with communities on the ground, I learned that I really had no idea. I just had the good fortune to go to Bangladesh and work with Rohingya refugees. And the first place we went was to a refugee camp that was made up of Hindu Rohingya. Now, everybody in the news talks about Rohingya Muslims. Well, there are 300 or 400 Rohingya Hindu refugees, and they are being persecuted by the Rohingya Muslims. And so, I would have never thought of that. There's, I think, only one academic article on that issue. It's such a, the different ways that people are oppressed is beyond what academics knows. And so, I think we need to, how far can we break out of academics while being in academia? And, and this idea, like you said, of thinking of new methods of being journalistic and listening to the people on the ground is so important. And I'll add one more point, if I may, which is on when we were working on the Juarez femicides. It's such a tragedy and it's so depressing. But that actually was one of what led me to write a book on joy and human rights. And it came out of that conference in New Mexico State. At the end of the conference, there was a party or get together at the dean's house. And I was in the back yard with 3 or 4 of the most famous family members of the victims of the femicides. And Lourdes Portillo was there, and she was translating when my Spanish wasn't good enough. And so the 5 of us were sitting back there, and we ended up telling jokes, and we ended up having a really good time, to the point that we thought that the police had been called to break up our party in the backyard. And so I got to see these women who are brought up on stage, around the world to tell their tragic stories. And I saw them as real people who have fun, who still experience joy, even though they had experienced this incredible tragedy in their lives. And I think that, when we work with a community, we often see them how we want to see them. We want to see marginalized people as really marginalized. We want to see people on their bad days, because that's what we're writing about. We're writing about genocide or apartheid or violence against women. But, the family members of the victims of the femicides, they're full people. They still have joy. They still find happiness. And I think we need to sometimes get out of academics to see that. And even, the consul was talking about the sexual violence against migrant women and children, incredibly tragic, but yet migrant women and children also have hopes, dreams, et cetera. They're not statistics. They're not just victims of violence. Many of them end up going to school. Many of them raise families. They get jobs. They celebrate holidays. So I think, that's a lot of, I guess my question is how far we can break out of academics in academia. And maybe we can't, I don't know.
Yes, well, I don't know, Amalia, if you want to add something. Okay. It's so important, what you are saying, Bill, like to rehumanize lives, rehumanize stories, rehumanize cases. And I think that I am very much willing to work more with this, from this journalistic approach, in terms of creating ways to disseminate information like short films or documentaries. I mean, it's so important to complement our projects. This week, this is just a brief announcement, but this week I made a short film. it's a short film that is called Vivas Transitamos. It's about women, migrant women that cross Mexico. And it was just a compliment of it was, I tried to create a product that was not academic, but that was part of a big project that actually ended up in the publication of a book that is about immigration detention. And I am impressed with the short film, the effect of the short film. It has much a wider effect than the book. The book was published 6 months ago, and the film has been just open to the public in the platform Filme Latino since last week. And the effect of the film, that is just a 20-minute film, is much more powerful because you get to see the stories. Even though in the book, I try to get, I don't call it resilience, but I try to rehumanize and to show both parts of the stories, not only from the point of view of women, migrant women, but also from the agents, immigration agents. When you see the film, the idea was to try to, that part, rehumanize the story. These are people that have suffered so much, but they are also enjoying, they also have affective relationships with the people that they are migrating with. They also share nice experiences with us when we're with a camera. So I think that is so important to connect people with the stories, because once in activism, once you connect with the case that you are trying to understand and emotionally connect, then I think you get a wider effect. And for this, I think that short films and other ways of creating non-academic products are key elements to push forward our activism from the academia, and also to transform academia. Because I didn't get 1 point for this short film. I mean, at UNAM, there is not even a way to report that short film. I don't have that in my yearly reports, but I don't care about that because the impact is much better. So it is just, I wanted to share this experience because it's a way to transform our daily practices and also to be able to create products. And Amalia, she's the artist of the group, together with Bill, to create other ways to communicate. I just wanted to add that.
Well, I'll quickly add, Alethea, that I've made 2 or 3 films over the years as well. And I had that exact same thing of, there's no place in my annual review or for my tenure file to note that I made a film. Academics has a certain way of looking at things, and they don't expect, a political scientist to make a film or to even reward that. And so, I think Amalia's work, Amalia is an actress and a dancer and everything else. And, I don't think that gets factored in very much into your annual reviews.
No, not at all. In fact, the arts, and that's another whole conversation, right, on how people don't take the arts seriously and the lack of funding, and, this idea that, you have to somehow produce this text that's legitimate, right? And that everything else is just, not taken seriously. And what both of you are saying, it really resonates, because I've thought a lot about this. And Alethea, you mentioned teaching the students journalistic research and journalistic writing as well. And I think it's so interesting because one project I worked on with the consortium was developing a journal, a special issue in a literary journal on gender-based violence. And the idea was that, we have all this research and that ends up in these siloed departments, right? And in these siloed academic journals that nobody even has access to. And so, that's another conversation, right? Is access to information, access to data. Speaking of data, right? And so, we were thinking, well, how about bringing together all different kinds of, writing and or even a writing style that will reach more people. And when we talk about film, it's the same thing. And I think there is this sort of, gatekeeping of information, right, in academia. And I think that is problematic. And so, another Another thing that I wanted to mention, and also I wanted to mention that, I think that what the arts does is that it brings out the nuance of human emotion, right? And when you bring out the nuance of human emotion, you encourage empathy. And so I think that that's something that, and that's, scientifically backed. I'm not just saying that, right? There's been research showing the impact of the arts on people's opinions and people's behaviors. So I wanted to point that out. And then really quickly, in discussing the idea of data and how to collect data, and this is something that I talked with Dawn and Anita a lot about. Again, just to mention again, Anita works with missing and murdered Indigenous women on the subject of that and their families, and Dawn works with more broadly femicide victims in the United States, and both of them, emphasize that it, of course, is extremely hard to collect this data, right? Because a lot of the data maybe that they're working with initially will be from law enforcement, that they don't have access to it, or law enforcement is hiding the data, right? And then, or the issue of being misgendered sometimes is a really big issue, and also misidentified. A lot of Indigenous tribal members are misidentified as not belonging to an Indigenous community or belonging to a different one, right? So how do you collect accurate data in light of a sort of lack of access to it, or a sort of campaign of misinformation on behalf of law enforcement? And again, it goes back to building trust within communities. Both of them emphasize, it's always about building trust, because some of this data is just going to be going kind of door to door, so to speak, talking to families, building trust, and creating meaningful stories for them. And oftentimes that is going to be through the arts. It's not going to be through collecting, necessarily a certain kind of academic research that will result in a journal paper. It'll be working with communities on a some kind of art project that has meaning, like the one that Bill, showed us at the beginning of this presentation.
Yes, totally agree with you, Amalia. I think that we're all running out of time, so maybe we can have just some minutes to close the panel and then go to the Q&A. We have some comments and some questions. Some of them have been already solved, but I don't know if you would like to add something, Bill or Amalia.
Yeah, I look forward to questions and answers and comments and suggestions and criticisms.
Okay, perfect. So we have los feminicidios y la violencia en la zona fronteriza llevan a dos formas diferentes de ataques a las mujeres. Si el resultado final es la muerte, se puede diferenciar entre las muertas de México y las del otro lado del río. So femicide and violence at the border are two different ways of attacking women. If the final result is death, can we differentiate between deaths in Mexico and between deaths in the US? Maybe we can gather some comments and questions, and then we have a chance to reply, right? Then, el feminicidio como asesinato de una mujer a manos de un hombre por machismo o misoginia. La palabra feminicidio es asumida como sinónimo, pero bueno, ya explicamos que es una diferencia también con la intervención del Estado y que feminicidio y femicidio no es lo mismo. Feminicidio o femicidio define un acto de violencia extrema contra las mujeres por el hecho de ser mujeres. Es una de las violaciones de los derechos humanos más graves, extendida, arraigada y tolerada en el mundo. El delito de feminicidio, acuñado en México por la antropóloga Marcela Lagarde con el término inglés femicide, originado en 1976, está tipificado en el país desde 2012 y hace referencia a los asesinatos contra mujeres, niñas y ancianas por el hecho de ser mujeres. Luego, there are states in the US that do not have the term femicide typified, right? What is the legal process when a feminicide run away to Mexico? I think, well, but he killed a woman in the US. How long can take the notification to get to Mexico? I think the council already addressed that one. Are the demographics of the women accounted for as well? Are there unfortunate statistics or demographics that tend to be more at risk? Making note of the MMIWG that makes place across the continent and disproportionate media attention when the victim is white or of a higher economic status. And I think the others are more comments. Very important to use actual tools and technologies such as Google Maps, like the one made by Maria Salguero for the Feminicidios in Mexico called Yo Te Nombro. Every time we use Google Maps, it should display such a map. Then Rafael Barceló, of course, he apologized because he left at 1 p.m. He had another meeting and he really apologized and regrets because there's nothing he could do. So no, it's okay. Thank you, Rafael, for being with us. Then, se requiere poner fin a la desigualdad de género. Los derechos humanos forman parte importante en esta gran conmemoración. Todo ello merece una sociedad justa y equitativa. La educación y el respeto son derechos a la integridad. Thanks everyone for such a good forum, but please, if you have chance, can you talk a little bit about the legal process in general? How does it work between nations, between Mexico and the US? Excelente ponencia, felicito a todos los ponentes, a Letia Fernández de la Reguera, Amalia Mora y Dr. Simmons por su extraordinaria ponencia en materia de prevención, en materia de feminicidio. Una fuerza abrazo desde Venezuela, de Pedro II. So those are our questions and those are the comments. So I don't know who would like to start.
I'll say something quick about the use of the term feminicide and how it's, a Latin American term. And I've done some work on gender-based violence in Africa, and it's a term that's just starting to be used there. And we just had speakers in one of my classes who are from Southern Africa, one from South Africa and one from Eswatini. And they, even though they'd probably be experts on gender-based violence in both countries, they never once used the term feminicide, I don't think. And I think, it's a really good question as to, what's the value of the term, and what's it mean in different contexts. And I think it would be really good to have a book on something like comparative migration or comparative feminicide studies, and see how it's used in different contexts. So I'll just add that piece.
Thank you, Bill. Amalia, would you like to add something?
Yes, I'm just reading some of the Spanish. It takes me a little longer to just listen, so I was just rereading some of the Spanish language questions. Well, I think that one interesting question addressed, if I can remember, because I was just really quickly skimming the questions again, was, regarding the difference between, or not the difference, like the intersection, right, between women who are killed on one side of the border or the other side of the border, if the result is that, death is the result of both. How do we sort of talk about the relationship, right, between, even though as it's so important, as Alethea, you mentioned, it's so important to be specific about the particular conditions that are leading to deaths in one context versus another, and then the border is a whole other conversation. But I think developing some kind of lexicon, to talk about these three scenarios as interrelated and yet specific, right, is so important. And you also mentioned, Alethea, like how, missing and murdered Indigenous women is very different, right, than, or the context in which that happens is very different than, let's say, a migrant woman crossing the US-Mexico border, right? And so maybe I'm posing a question to you as Alethea, is like, how do you see that lexicon forming? And I think you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion the importance of recognizing all of the legal frameworks that have been developed in Latin America on this topic, and maybe how we can use them in the United States to discuss this issue. But you know, I don't know, that I'm thinking aloud here and thinking about how do we develop a dialogue that addresses the similarities, but also the very specific differences? And that's a very good question, because it makes me, it's a good food for thought.
Thank you. Yeah, for me the same. I mean, I was thinking about there are many things that we share now. At the end, these are crimes against women. I don't like to say only because they are women, because many people don't know what does it mean to be a woman. Even we, as experts on gender, we need to contextualize what does it mean to be a Black woman living in a particular neighborhood, or what does it mean to be a Mexican woman, second generation. I mean, intersectionality is there. But I would say that the cultural, the structural, and direct violence is in both sides of the border. I mean, even necropolitics as well. There are many studies that are very interesting regarding from the political, from the economic, from the legal perspective, this coalition in not formal. I'm not talking about formal mechanisms, but about informal mechanisms that for many years have created these discourses of criminals that are in the border, and that women that are killed because they are public women, and that it was a way even to think about the safety of the communities at both sides of the border. Just like the same like discourses that we have against narco traffickers, that if they killed among themselves, it's okay because they are into this business, no? So in some way, many women that for many years were killed in Juarez, there was this discourse at both sides of the border that they were looking for it because they were not actually good behaving women. They were maybe sexual workers, or they were outside at night, whatever. So it is such an interesting and profound question, because there are many things to think about what is similar at both sides of the border. And I would add that maybe in terms of the gross numbers, we know that in the US, it is much more an intimate partner violence, and that women are also, in Mexican and immigrant women, are very much in risk, especially if they are undocumented when they are at the other side of the border. And in Mexico, organized crime is a very important context to analyze femicide. So criminal violence is in both sides of the border, but I would say it is highlighted in the side of Mexico, and maybe intimate partner violence in the US. Particularly the discussion now in the US is also gun possession, and how many houses, how many families in the US, they have access to guns. So thank you for this question. And just about what you were saying, Amalia, there is a rich discussion on lexicon forming, on terminology, particularly from the legal perspective. I really don't know. I don't have a position, because after reading and learning so many aspects of the different countries in Latin America, and how is typified, how femicide is typified in Mexico, each state typifies femicide. When you have very open definitions of femicide, sometimes it's easier for judges to interpret, but at the same time, they don't have a will to make a precision of femicide, and they treat this as homicide because they don't see the much differences. On the other side, when you have a very particular and very comprehensive definition of femicide, it signifies more obstacles and more barriers for judges and for law enforcement agencies to have enough possibilities to address it as femicide. So I think we still need to learn much about the impacts and all the efforts that activists and feminist activists have actually put into the table for for legal and criminal frameworks to understand femicide. And there is still much to work on this lexicon, how to typify, what are best practices. Argentina has a good practice as well, because they typify as part of gender-based violence, and they include trans femicide. We haven't talked about that today. Maybe this is for another roundtable, that it's not only the killing of women, but it's the killing of LGBT communities. So I would say just check on Argentina's case, because it is actually one of the good practices in the region. And I don't know if there is anything else that we would like to add.
Thank you so much. And it made me think about, you mentioned a couple of things that really resonated with me. First of all, in terms of legal policies, and in my class, we just went over domestic violence laws in the United States, and in exactly what you're talking about relating to, being too specific in the laws is problematic, but also being too general is also, in these laws is also poses a problem, because then it leaves things very open to interpretation, especially if there's any kind of misogynistic bias on the part of the court or the judge. So, it's very complicated. And so thank you for that, for making me think about that. And also one thing you mentioned was, in terms of thinking about the relationship between the murdering of women on both sides of the border, and the relationship and how to talk about it, and thinking about state complicity and guns. And I was thinking about, the importance of also recognizing the complicity of the US state in providing arms, to Central American countries, as a result of the Cold War. And then, the impact of that on, how that has allowed gangs in Central America to be armed, and the war on drugs, and how all of that has fed into gender-based violence and the resultant fleeing of women, across the border. And then, of course, the violence that they then experience through border control and detention centers. And so I think that there actually is a lot of, US state complicity when it comes to lives, even when those lives are not in the United States, even when they are in their home countries, even when these women are in their home countries and then fleeing, that there is sort of binational state complicity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I think that's just an important piece that I was just thinking of.
Yes, Amalia, it's such an important case. I mean, last week it was in the news, and for the last months, this legal, I don't know if it's called, es una demanda, legal complaint from the Mexican government. For the first time, the Mexican government presents a formal legal complaint against the US for this traffic of arms. So it's really that topic for the moment, and particularly if we discuss femicide from a binational perspective. So we are also running out of time. I don't know, Bill, because I need to give the review in Spanish. That's why I'm thinking about. So, but please, you have some minutes to close, both you, Amalia, and Bill.
Amalia, do you want to go first?
I just wanted to thank everybody for this opportunity, for this discussion, and I'm again, I agree, Alethea. This has just made me think of so many other, roundtables that could happen, like you talk about, the murder and violence against transgender communities, and I think, in talking about this as really a phenomenon that's, again, violence against any being that is really considered antithetical to our understanding of normative masculinity, and really the way in which transgender communities are seen as really a threat to normative masculinity ultimately, and that this is ultimately what this is about, right? So I think that's such an important point, and I would love to continue that conversation and so many more. So again, just thank you to everyone for this opportunity, and I'll pass the mic on to Bill.
Yeah, and thank you, Amalia. And just I want to thank everyone as well. And I want to special thanks to Alethea, who not only has been moderating, but also been chiming in as well. And I know that's pretty hard to juggle all of those things. So, and also to the audience, I know we answered a few questions, and they led to more questions. And I please, if you want to be part of this conversation, please email us. We're easy to find on the internet. We'd love to get your input on this. We're always In the Human Rights Practice Program, we're teaching courses on these kinds of issues all the time, always looking for guest speakers, always looking for projects to work on in different countries, you know, so, and always looking for partners and collaborators. So, you know, I really appreciate this. And I think anything, I think Alethea's comment about rehumanization might be a really important touchstone that we can leave with as something more positive and something, you know, to do whatever we can to rehumanize those who've been dehumanized by the system.
Muchas gracias, Bill. Pues gracias a todas las personas que estuvieron con nosotros, a Amalia, también al cónsul Rafael, a la doctora Elena Centeno, al doctor Arnoldo Bautista. Voy a hacer como un cierre muy breve, ¿no? Este panel es pues un poco una muestra del tipo de intercambio que hemos tenido, las colaboraciones tanto en la enseñanza como en la investigación que hacemos entre la UNAM y la Universidad de Arizona. Muchísimas gracias, doctora Centeno, porque siempre tienes ese motivación y ese impulso para apoyarnos en este tipo de iniciativas. En realidad, pues comenzamos el panel con esta muy interesante propuesta, ese trabajo de activismo que a lo largo de 10 años, el proyecto Redressing Injustice, ¿no? Con el tema de los vestidos y las víctimas de los feminicidios, y cómo fue un proyecto que no solamente viajó por el mundo, sino que hizo mucha comunidad, una comunidad que hoy en día sigue activa con la Universidad de Tucson. Y bueno, creo que han sido muy interesantes las ponencias, ¿no? Se habló por parte del Consulado Mexicano de la importancia de dar a conocer el feminicidio, inclusive decir, un avance dentro del Estado es empezar a reconocer y a particularizar el tipo de atención que requieren las familias mixtas, las familias binacionales. Por otro lado, el trabajo de Amalia, muy interesante desde la perspectiva del arte, de los derechos humanos, y cómo muchas veces el abordaje teórico, ¿no? Realmente decimos, la teoría no va a tener un impacto si no realmente puede aterrizarse en el entorno comunitario, y por eso tan importante el trabajo de campo con los estudiantes, tener formas de pedagógicas de poder enseñar estando en la comunidad, metodologías de intervención. Y bueno, pues aquí la importancia que hemos tenido también y nuestra buena experiencia al trabajar con estudiantes ya en casos particulares de campo, ¿no? Que es lo que hemos estado haciendo con esta materia de feminicidios y muchas otras del programa de derechos humanos de la Universidad de Arizona, que ahora le abre las puertas también a esta colaboración con la UNAM. Y bueno, pues nada, hablamos de otros temas muy importantes como la investigación periodística. Qué importante es también de repente sacudirnos un poco las metodologías y las teorías tan académicas y pensar en cómo aprender del periodismo de investigación, con el caso de Maricela Escobedo, de otras formas también muy importantes a través del audiovisual, de programas artísticos, como decía Amalia, acercarnos a las familias y entender que la interseccionalidad se vive en el campo, que a veces nuestros conceptos que tenemos teóricos, pues cuando hemos llegado a las comunidades civil, que es la persona que creo que tiene más experiencia en este panel, ha trabajado en muchos países, en diversos proyectos, y bueno, que realmente no hay nada como estar en el campo y desde ahí poder transformar. Hicimos también una crítica a estas formas como muy académicas de entender nuestra forma de investigar y de pensar en cómo rehumanizar las narrativas a través de otros productos no académicos, como son los cortometrajes, como son los artículos periodísticos, y lograr llevar estas narrativas como lo que hicimos el día de hoy con este panel, que fue un panel un poco distinto en el formato. Intentamos hacer una plática muy abierta para llegarle a un público diverso, no un público tan académico, y la verdad es que ha sido una gran experiencia en intercambiar con mis compañeros. Y bueno, nada, decir que en este tema en particular, feminicidios, los avances siempre van a estar de la mano de las activistas, que son de quienes aprendemos, de las colectivas feministas, que son quienes en gran medida han llevado estos temas a las cortes, han impulsado los marcos jurídicos, las políticas públicas. Y bueno, pues nada, creo que con esto cerramos. Ha sido una gran experiencia, esperemos tener la oportunidad de continuar. Hay temas que se quedaron un poco en el tintero, el tema de los transfeminicidios, de cómo pensar en qué marcos jurídicos y cómo tipificar el feminicidio para incluir no solamente a las mujeres, sino incluir también a las personas de la diversidad sexual, que por no cumplir estos mandatos tradicionales de género, son las causas, ¿no? También por lo cual están siendo asesinadas y desaparecidas. Pues muchas gracias a todos, Elena, Arnoldo, Bill, Amalia y Rafael, y esperemos continuar este diálogo.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Aletia. Thank you, Amalia. Thank you, Bill, for taking the time to be discussing such an important topic that is, you know, the concern is for both countries, and it really affects both countries at the border. So that's something that we have to work together. I mean, there is no other way to really change the tendencies of this terrible situation we live. I want to also thank Rafael Barceló, who had to leave because of his duties as a consul. He had a call and he couldn't stay for all the time. Voy a cerrar en español. Quiero darles las gracias a todos ustedes. Este es un tema muy importante, fundamental, que debemos discutir desde la perspectiva binacional. Los invito a que estén pendientes. Estaremos organizando más eventos de esta naturaleza. Hemos tenido una colaboración excelente con la Universidad de Arizona a través del Consorcio Binacional sobre Derechos Humanos y Migración, y esperemos que podamos tenerlos a ustedes discutiendo estos temas más adelante. Gracias y que tengan muy buen día.
Recording